Hey guys, this is Jan for Chess24, and we keep studying the work of the chess world champion. Mr. Magnus Carlsen has won 5 games in a row in Wijk in the Super Tournament. He's dealing with Teimour Radjabov today in the 9th round, I believe it is. It is the 9th round. Carlsen trying to make it 6 wins in a row, getting closer to Fabiano Caruana's recent streak of 7 out of 7 in Sinquefield Cup in St. Louis. Let's have a look at the tournament standings, if I manage to bring them up. Here they are. Magnus Carlsen on 6 out of 8. Started with 1 out of 3, then won 5 in a row. And he's facing Teimour Radjabov today, who's at 4.5 out of 8, or +1 in chess lingo, playing a very solid tournament himself. The Azeri, who had a terrible candidates tournament in London 2013, and has been in a bit of a downhill spiral since then. Used to be close to 2800 and a top 5 player in the world. Fell all the way to 2700, but stabilized a bit in 2014, won some rating points back, and more importantly, he beat Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces in their last encounter in a nice King's Indian game in Shamkir 2014. So the world champion is going to be motivated enough to win this game. Let's see how he goes about it with the white pieces. He plays the move e4, his favorite move. Radjabov goes e5, the main line at the highest level, the most solid. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and Radjabov goes for the Berlin defense. Move we haven't seen all that much in Wijk. It's a very common guest in every other super tournament. In this one, I believe only Radjabov's been employing it, and it's the second game I can recall with it only. However, Magnus Carlsen has had quite a bit of practice with the move knight f6 in his recent match against Vishy Anand, who played this 4 times, 5 times? I think 4 times. And in this game, Carlsen embarks on the move d3, which he played in the second match game against Vishy Anand as well, won that game, then switch to the main line, the ending, which occurs after short castles. Today he feels like keeping the pieces on the board, plays d3 against Radjabov. Radjabov plays the main move, bishop to c5, developing the bishop. Now the first very small surprise, the move castles. It's not a big surprise because it's a move Carlsen already played against Anand, but it is not the most popular move in this position. More common are bishop takes c6, when black has to recapture with a d-pawn in order to avoid knight takes e5, which runs into queen d4 with a double attack. So you have to go d takes c, and you can't go b takes c. Just for context, because we will get a b takes c structure later in the game. So bishop takes c6 is one main move, c3 is the other main move, trying to dominate this knight on c6. Which I always thought was black's main problem in all these positions. The knight on c6 is a little misplaced, it has to be regrouped. Hence, after castles, I'm always surprised if black does not go knight to d4, exchanging his knight for the white knight, and according to my knowledge, kind of solving his problems by doing so. However, both Radjabov and Anand have not done this recently against Carlsen, so they might know something that I'm not aware of. Instead, they both played the move d6, which is of course completely natural, covering the e5 pawn. Carlsen goes for the move knight bd2. Against Anand he played rook to e1, but they can easily transpose back into each other. Both are kind of natural but non-committal moves. Main line is c3 here. Knight bd2, castles, and now is where it gets interesting. Once again, the world champion repeats the strategic idea he already used against Vishy Anand, and it's an idea we haven't seen all that much, or at least I haven't seen all that much in the structure. He goes bishop takes c6 in a position where black is able to recapture towards the center with a b-pawn. And of course he does, only move b takes c6. This structure was not supposed to give white any advantage whatsoever. However, Carlsen plays it for the second time. He clearly found something he likes here. Maybe it's not that he thinks he's objectively much better, but he thinks it's unbalanced, it's a fresh structure. He can outplay his opponents here. So bishop c6 does lose the 2 bishops, which of course is a concession, but in return it gives black an isolated a-pawn, which Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it could become a problem. It gives him these double C pawns, which could also become targets. And as I mentioned, it gives us a structure we haven't seen all that much. Carlsen proceeds with very typical Spanish moves. The move h3, black goes h6, just as typical, rook to e1, preparing the standard knight maneuver, knight f1, planning to go knight g3, so this knight is out of the way and this bishop can be developed, or white can think about gaining space in the center. Black goes rook to e8, also fairly typical, knight to f1, and the move a5. This move is actually a novelty. This position has already been seen at the highest level in a game between Michael Adams and Vladimir Kramnik. The Russian former world champion went for the move d5 here, gaining space in the center, which also looks like a pretty decent move. Kramnik went on to win that game after e takes d5, but it had nothing to do with the opening. Of course, white has plenty of options here. Knight g3, one of them, queen e2, one of them, or e takes d5 is played. Could lead to a different game. Radjabov's move a5 is also pretty logical. He activates this pawn, which is a bit of a weakness. Maybe wants to push it up all the way to a4 to gain some more space. Maybe wants to clear this square for the bishop if needed. Doesn't look like a bad move at all. Knight to g3, and the next move, and actually the next sequence of moves are confusing me. I've looked at them, I've given them some thought, but I can't really explain them. And I think they might not have been ideal play, even though they're no disaster either. Starts with the move rook to b8, which, okay, I kind of get it. You want to stop white from going bishop e3 or bishop d2 by attacking the b2 pawn. And white has to go b3 in order to be able to move his bishop. Now after b3, what I was thinking, okay, you provoke b3, so now you want to go a4 and exchange your a pawn, which is a weakness, for the white b pawn. Since b takes a4 is not really any dangerous, black can even just go back, and he will recapture this pawn sooner or later, while white has spoiled his own structure. So that's what I was expecting. But Radjabov thought for half an hour here, long time, and then came up with a very surprising move. And I can't really understand it. Move bishop to b4, which looks like, okay, it attacks the rook, but probably Carlsen's gonna spot that. It looks like it's a bit of a loss of time. So I'm not quite sure what his thought process was behind this move. Carlsen goes bishop d2, the obvious reaction. And the next strange move, even though the computer says this is the best move, but it does not speak highly about the last two moves then. The move rook back to a8. Once again, not easy to understand. Probably after something like bishop e6, a3 is a bit of a problem. Bishop takes, queen takes, and this pawn is under attack. So rook to a8 goes back to defending the pawn, but of course it does not go well with a5 or bishop b4 or rook b8 earlier. Still, the position is kind of close, so this is not the end of the world, but Carlsen feels like he should kind of try to punish his opponent's indecencies, and he goes for the move c3, changing the structure. I'm not sure this was needed. You could also make a case for a move like a4, trying to fix the pawn on a5, leading to a slower maneuvering game, where now white might very well have a small advantage. c3 was played by Carlsen, bishop returns to c5, so both the bishop and the rook have not changed their positions since here, while white has made some extra moves. Here we are. Still, you could argue that the extra moves white got weren't all that useful. Carlsen tries to use them, plays the move d4, occupying the center. Now e takes d4 was a possibility, but it looks a bit anti-positional to give up this stronghold on e5. Therefore, Radjabov prefers to keep the tension and go bishop b6 immediately. Carlsen also wants to determine the structure as quickly as possible, goes d takes e5. Black has to go d takes e5. And Carlsen plays c4. A good move, first of all, giving this bishop a clear view. And secondly, preparing to threaten c5 in the future. After a move like queen c2 or rook c1 or even bishop e3, c5 will be a question because black cannot allow this to happen and to put his bishop to a7 where it would be buried alive. So this will be a strategic decision later. else the position is kind of stabilized. Black still has the two bishops, but at the moment they struggle to find work. Especially the bishop on c8 can often be a bit of a problem in these structures if it has nothing to do. While black has these double pawns, however, they are not a weakness at the moment, and they actually do control some important squares. Enough arrows. One drawback of white's last move, c4, is it weakens the d4 square, and Radjabov immediately adjusts to that, goes for the move knight h7, which is sending this knight on a long trip, f8, e6, d4. That's the idea. And keep in mind that this will be the key topic of the rest of the game, really. Will black manage to get his knight to d4 or not? This will be what the strategic fight is about. If black manages to get his knight there, he's going to be in good shape. If he doesn't, he's going to be in trouble. Queen e2, bit of a strange start. I was expecting the move queen c2, threatening c5, which looks just as harmonious, planning to go rook d1 and bishop e3 if needed, but asking black some tricky questions. Said Carlsen, goes queen e2, which costs like half a tempo maybe, but he preferred his queen on that square. Knight to f8. And now the idea of queen e2, he wants to go bishop e3. Offering the exchange of bishops and being able to recapture here with the queen. And first time that black is dealing with this dilemma. He has to stop the threat of c5. Knight e6 doesn't work yet because this pawn on e5 is under attack. This is always a key topic as well. And c5, as mentioned, is a lethal threat because you can't allow your bishop to be stuck on a7 where it can never escape. The most obvious way to avoid this would be bishop e3, but after queen e3, I believe white is a bit better. This bishop, first of all, was guarding the c5 square, which has now been weakened. Black is still not ready to go knight e6 because of knight takes e5. White will follow up with rook d1, then try to make something happen on the queen side, probably connected with the move knight f5, and he would just have very good control over the position, while black no longer has the two bishops and no longer has any squares to really hope for. So Radjabov, I believe correctly, went for a move that looks quite strange at first sight, but I think it's a good decision. He goes for the move c5, burying his bishop alive on the b6 square. Now this bishop is very passive, admittedly, doesn't really have anywhere to go, but it has potential to go somewhere in the future. After a4, the a5 square could be made available. After c6, it could return. It does defend these three pawns at the moment, which might sound silly, but there is this saying, which is very true, that bad bishops defend good pawns. More importantly, with the bishop on b6 and the pawn on c5, black has a powerful construction to get in knight e6, knight d4. And if he manages to get this in, all his troubles would be over. This knight would be so powerful that black can easily regroup behind it. So the struggle more than ever is about knight e6, knight d4. Can black get that in or can he not? Carlsen starts by going rook a1. This clearly avoids knight e6 because the queen is under attack. Queen goes to f6. Same principle, let's keep attacking it. He goes knight h5, which first of all hits the queen, and secondly, a typical tool of Magnus Carlsen, slowly but surely, almost it looks accidentally, but it's not, his pieces maneuver towards the king side and find themselves in attacking positions. A very typical slow start to Carlsen kingside attack. Queen went back to e7. Queen g6 might look obvious, but that runs into the very strong knight to h4, attacking the queen again, defending this knight with his own queen. The problem for black is that queen takes e4 does not work because of a cute little tactic. Knight takes g7. Attacks the rook, and if the king were to recapture on g7, bishop takes h6, picks up the queen. Check, and the queen is under attack. So that didn't work, and therefore Radjabov had to retreat the queen. The problem now with the queen on e7 is that, once again, you're not threatening knight e6 because the pawn on e5 is under attack. Carlsen goes knight h2, which actually stops attacking the pawn on e5. And curiously, black does not go for the move knight e6 here. So let's wonder why he didn't do that. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe actually should have. Maybe this was his one chance. I'm assuming he did not like either the move queen g4, putting pressure on the g7 pawn and threatening bishop h6, where it looks like black had to find the move g6, but this is very dangerous over the board, or I'm assuming that's what he thought, because the h6 pawn would be dropping. However, white cannot take on h6 in this position because there is once again a tactic, the move knight g7, and all of a sudden the queen on g4 is under attack, while this knight is under attack as well. So this does not work for white. Knight e6 therefore was possible. Maybe this was the one spot to do it. Queen g4 didn't look all that strong. Computer says white is still a bit better after the move queen f3, trying to make it to the g file. Queen g3 next. But it looks to me like black should be able to hold on here. Something like king h8, queen g3, f6. And the position is very, very unclear with his knight being ready to jump to the center. Radjabov decided to get his king out of the line of fire first, went king h7, which is a very good move on general terms. But as I said, timing is everything, and this position is very concrete. You either get in knight e6 or you don't, and he might not get a second chance so quickly. Carlsen went queen f3, stopping knight e6. Does it stop knight e6? I think it stops it because of queen f5 check. And after g6, there's knight f6 check winning, else the pawn on e5 is on priest. So knight e6 defended, check. Instead, Radjabov went f6, covering the e5 pawn and preparing knight e6, knight d4. However, f6 also has its drawbacks. It always has in these structures, that it weakens the light squares on the king side. And this, keep this in mind, this will become a problem. Carlsen immediately starts trying to exploit that with the move knight to g4. This knight can't be left alive. It just threatens too many things. Knight takes f6 is already a huge threat. Knight h6 is in the air. Bishop h6, knight g7. So you can't tolerate this knight. It has to be taken off. Bishop takes g4. Here it's a bit of a tough decision if one should recapture it with a queen or the pawn. Computer says taking with a pawn is correct. Humans, the world champion, says taking with a queen is correct, which looks much more normal on general terms. Queen is nice on this diagonal and it's getting closer to these weakened light squares. Question is, could black have gotten away with playing the move g6 here? He did not play this in the game, but this might have been critical, trying to kick this knight out of h5, and if it has to retreat, knight g3, a4, trying to finally activate some of his pieces. This rook frees the square for the bishop. And the plan of knight e6, knight d4, of course, is still very much alive. Looks like black could be okay here. Queen h4 attacking this pawn doesn't do all that much. Queen g7, bit passive. However, knight e6, knight d4 is still the plan. It looks like white is not in time here to stop it, and hence black is okay still. He certainly should have done that. However, Radjabov had drifted into time trouble at this point already because, well, the battle has been very irrational, not problems you see every day. And that's also the forte of Carlsen, and one reason why he probably chose this line which he chose with the seldomly played bishop takes c6, b takes c6, that it poses fresh strategic problems, and Radjabov spent a lot of time trying to navigate those, and this is time he was missing now. He was in serious time trouble, and he committed a big mistake here, the move rook e d8. This doesn't lose material or anything, but it is just one step too slow, and now the eternal fight over knight e6, knight d4 will be lost because white seizes the initiative, playing very powerfully. Starts with the move queen f5 check. g6 is no longer possible because f6 is under attack, so the king has to go back to h8, and Carlsen plays f4, starting a very typical Magnus Carlsen kingside attack. No fancy piece sacrifices, just the pieces on better squares on the king side, and eventually something will happen. Knight e6 once again doesn't work because e5 is on priest. Radjabov took on f4, bishop takes, but here we can see the difference in piece activity is very significant. And this bishop is still very much out of the game. So if black does not manage or has not managed to get his knight here, this will become a problem. And that's what happened. Queen to e6 was played. Radjabov, of course, senses that something has gone wrong, tries to exchange queens, but turns out that queen takes f5 is not really a threat, and Carlsen plays a very strong move once again. Very quiet, the move rook to d3. First of all, he's saying, okay, I want to include my last piece into the attack, if you don't mind, and feel free to exchange queens, because after queen f5, e f5, your pieces are basically stalemated. This bishop can't do anything, and all of a sudden this knight is also unable to go anywhere because of the pawn on f5. Can't go to d7, can't go to e6, can't go to g6. If it went to h7, white could be cruel and play the move h4, closing the door to the g5 square, when the black pieces are really a sorry sight. Therefore, Radjabov probably realized now queen takes f5, he can't really play. He played the move rook to e8, threatening queen takes e4, but rook e8 is the, I'm not sure, I think the decisive mistake was already earlier, rook e d8, but rook e8 is a move that allows a combination, and the world champion does spot this combination and he goes for it. So earlier he doesn't need a piece sacrifice in his kingside attack, but if a piece sacrifice works, he will play it, and this is the case here. Magnus Carlsen goes for knight takes g7, gives up his knight on the g7 square. King takes g7, and now we see the point. It's the quiet move, queen to h5, attacking the h6 pawn. There is no defense for black at all. Rook g3 is a threat, and queen h6 or bishop h6 are threats. There's nothing black can do about it. Knight g6, for example, runs into queen h6, king f7, queen h7, king f8. Not only is this knight lost, but there's also bishop h6 checkmate, so this doesn't work. f5 is another move that comes to mind, so that the queen can cover the c6 square, but after just e takes f5, queen is also busy covering this rook on e8, so it would have to go to c6. The h6 square, sorry, I said c6 square earlier, the h6 square. Now the queen would have to go to c6, and white just wins with rook g3 check, for example, king h7, queen f7, king h8, queen g7, checkmate. So there's not really a defense. Radjabov plays the most resilient move, the move knight to h7, which at least gives the king shelter on the h8 square. Carlsen had, of course, seen this coming. He goes for bishop h6, king h8, and queen to g6. Threatens mate on the g7 square. The most natural move is the move rook to g8, but rook g8 has one small problem. This is the move rook d8, a nice little tactical blow, distracting this rook and pinning it, stopping it from going rook takes g6. Well, after rook takes d8, there is queen g7 checkmate, and queen g7 checkmate is a threat even now. So you can't go rook g8, there's no defense here, it's mate very quickly. Check it out for yourself, and let's check in with the players to see what Radjabov did instead. If this works, here we got the players. Radjabov with black is thinking, went for the move queen to g8. Of course, he spotted this trick, but Carlsen was ready for this, and here he goes, bishop g7, picking up the rook on e8 by sacrificing his bishop. Queen g7. We see the world champion writing down his move very carefully, and once he's done, he does pick up the rook. Queen takes e8, and let's check what this new situation gives us. Queen to g8 was the move played, only move. Bishop g7, queen g7, queen e8. Materially speaking, black is not doing that badly. He has two pieces for a rook. Okay, white has two pawns as well. But it's not the material balance that is black's concern here. His problem is his pieces are just too passive. While the white queen and rook are very active, are perfectly coordinated, the black king is weak, so black just doesn't have the resources to defend his position here. He goes queen f8. Knight f8 would have led to a pretty finish as well. Of course, there's more than one way, but I like this one. e5, opening up the position further. F takes e5, rook to f3. Attacking the knight. King g8 is the only move to defend it. And now the quiet little move, king to h2, completely overstretches black's defense. Threat is rook g3, winning the queen, and there's just absolutely nothing black can do. He can thank his bishop on b6 for this. There's no defense. Rook g3 is a massive threat, and whatever black does, he loses a piece minimum. Queen h6, for example. Many ways to win, but the easiest, queen f7, followed by queen takes f8 check. So knight f8 didn't work, or didn't change anything. Radjabov tried queen f8, but doesn't solve his problem of his pieces being very passive. Carlsen just goes queen e6, keeping the queens on the board. And the struggle has basically been decided. Radjabov went queen h6. He could have tried knight g5. This looks a bit more active, but then just queen to f5. White is a very straightforward plan of going rook d7 and h4 and checkmating black, while there's a lot of side threats like e5. It's just a hopeless position because the bishop on b6 is not participating. Radjabov played queen h6. Carlsen went e5, exploiting this pin and also opening the position even further. Queen c1 check. In German we call this Racheschach. I believe spite check is the correct translation. King a2, queen f4, another spite check. But they don't achieve all that much. White only has one good move, but it's more than good enough. It's the move rook to g3. Not only covering the check, but also threatening queen g8, checkmate. And Radjabov had seen enough. He decided to resign here. The only way to defend against that checkmate, that it doesn't give up the queen, is the move knight g5. But then white has plenty of ways to win. He could even go for the ending, which is completely winning queen f6 and ef6, and these three passed pawns would win the day. But he could also go for a move like queen e7, threatening e takes f6, and is also just resigns. So another win for world champion Magnus Carlsen. He makes it 6 in a row. He's playing against Vasily Ivanchuk in the 10th round, which is going to be exciting to see if Carlsen can really manage to pull off a Fabiano and win 7 games in a row, which was done by his closest rival, Fabiano Caruana, in St. Louis. Very impressive performance by the world champion. Today was a bit of a weird game, very hard to explain where it went wrong, very small subtleties. But in the end, Carlsen did understand the position better, spent less time, and came through in Radjabov's time trouble. Congratulations to the world champion. It's going to be exciting to see if he can make it 7. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you around on this channel. Bye.